Breakthrough, Chapter 3, Nick. Nick flipped a switch on the reader and the machine powered down, the screen going dark. Okay, you're done, he told the boy he had been testing. He smiled as the boy stood up. Happy birthday, by the way. Thanks, the boy said and exited the room. Nick breathed a sigh of relief. One of his many tests was over, and he felt good about it. Good job. Nick turned to see the director of training, who was also the former master of the reader, standing in the doorway. Thank you, sir, Nick said politely. Do we move on tomorrow? Yes, the director replied. You were the last one. Good, Nick said, then hurried from the room. Back in the dormitory, he found the rest of the people in the training group sitting on their beds waiting for him. Well, how did it go? Andrew, another man in training, asked. I think it went reasonably well, Nick answered. He noticed some people giving him jealous looks. There were 30 men in all. There had been many more, but each night, some were eliminated. They were all training to be the master of the reader. They'd been officially in training for several years, but only in the last several weeks had they been brought together. The training was done. Now, it was just a matter of testing to see who would be best. For the moment, Nick was one of the top 5, but that could change in a matter of days. Because the testing was almost over, they had less than a week before the master of the reader would be announced. Have today's eliminations been announced yet? Nick asked. Andrew shook his head. I think they're going to tell us at supper, he said. Yeah, someone else chimed in. They're probably waiting for Nick to get tested in case they have to get rid of him. You would like that, wouldn't you? Nick asked. Yeah, the man responded. Then I'd be that much closer to being chosen. Nick couldn't help but notice how closely that boy's words matched his own thoughts. I'm sure we all feel that way, Liam, another boy commented. And I'd say you're a lot closer to getting kicked out than Nick. Liam scowled. What do you know about it, John? He asked. It's not like you've seen the scores. No, I haven't, John agreed. But I have seen you in training. As the two continued to argue, Nick thought how competitive things were getting. Of course, they'd always been competing, but it hadn't seemed nearly so intense back when they were learning the basics. Even a month ago, it hadn't been this bad. But now, with the decision just days away, they were all at each other's throats. Just then, a loud bell rang, calling them to dinner. Immediately, all the men hurried to their feet and rushed from the room. Nick, you coming? Andrew asked from the doorway. In a minute, he replied. I just need to change. Okay, Andrew said and walked out the door. In the empty room, Nick began thinking about what he would do if he was not chosen. He had always wanted to be master of the reader, and he'd never thought much about what would happen if he did not win. Of course, they'd had to learn other things, but Nick had never really paid much attention to those other things. He'd always just assumed he would be master of the reader. It was only now, surrounded by all of these people who were just as determined to win as he was, that he began to have doubts. If he didn't win, he'd have to go home. Then, well, he would probably just go back to school. He had no idea what he would do, but he figured he'd come up with something. Still, he couldn't imagine having any other dream. He knew he shouldn't obsess. It wouldn't do him a single bit of good. So he quickly changed out of his uniform and hurried down to dinner. The dining room was emptier than it had been the day before. More people had been dismissed. It was scary how few of them there were now. 3 weeks ago, there had been over 100. Now only 30 remained. Nick got her dinner and sat down next to Andrew. What took you so long? Andrew asked. I was just thinking, Nick replied. He didn't elaborate. He and Andrew were friends, but they were also competing against each other, and they were both doing very well. As they were finishing dinner, the loudspeaker clicked on and everyone fell silent. Attention, everyone, the director said. I will now tell you who has been rejected today. John Ryan, he read, Liam Turner, Sam Rain. As the names continued, Nick watched as each person slowly stood up and left the room, with various degrees of disappointment. There were 10 names on the list that day. 3 more tests, the director reminded them. 3 more tests and we will have our new master of the reader. Yes, thought Nick. 3 more tests and I'd better do well. That person had better be me. The next morning, Nick was eating breakfast when the overhead speaker beeped. Could Nicholas Endless report to the reader room immediately? The voice requested. Nick wasn't surprised. For the last week, they'd been taking everyone out one at a time to do some tests. They didn't know what it was, and the people who did it wouldn't say. Have fun, Andrew. Have fun, Andrew, who had already done the tests, said as Nick stuffed the rest of his toast into his mouth and stood. Nick nodded, not feeling the need to answer. It wasn't as if Andrew really wanted him to. Well, good luck, someone else called as Nick was leaving. He turned around and saw that it was Cameron, a boy who really annoyed Nick. He seemed not to care whether or not he got the position, and seemed to go through the program effortlessly, even as everyone else struggled to learn the material. Thanks, he said anyway. When he reached the room, he found a middle-aged woman sitting in the chair, looking bleakly off into the distance. The director stood next to her, along with several guards. Immediately, Nick understood exactly what he had been brought there to do. She lied, he said. It wasn't a question. The director nodded. Yes, and it is your job to kill her. Of course, Nick replied, trying to keep the note of apprehension out of his voice. Of course, he'd known the day would come when he would have to kill a liar, but he'd been putting it out of his mind. The director pointed to the cabinet where the needles were stored. Don't I need to test her first? Nick inquired. Nope, the director replied. We have taken care of that. Your job today is simply to take her life. With shaking hands, Nick pulled open the cabinet and took out a needle. No, please, the woman begged. I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sorry for lying, and I promise I'll never do it again. You should have thought that before you lied, the director said. It was just one day, the woman said, still trying to plead her case, even though she must have known there was no point. I just needed a little time off, but I knew I wouldn't be able to get it unless I was sick, so I pretended. You lied to multiple people, the director said. I know, and I regret that, she said, but it happened almost 10 years ago. Well, you got tested today, and now you will pay for your crime, the director said impassively. The woman began to scream, and Nick wanted to leave more than anything, but he didn't. He'd had this chance once before, but he hadn't been able to go through with it. This time would be different. He wanted to be master of the reader, and he knew that being able to kill liars was one of the things he would need to do. So he walked over to the woman, rolled up her sleeve, and slid the needle into her arm. Please, the woman said one more time. Then her words dissolved into a cry of agony. It was that simple. There was no disinfectant, no bandages, just the stab of the needle, and after a few more seconds, the woman's screams died and she collapsed. Nick threw away the needle and turned to look at the director. Are they all like that? He asked. The director smiled. Don't worry, he said. Most of them aren't that bad. Well, that's good, Nick said. You did well, though, the director said, sounding surprised. You may join the others, but don't tell anyone about this. We still have a few more to test. Of course not, Nick assured him. And then he fled. It hadn't been fun, but he'd done it. He'd done it, and he was one step closer to getting the position he felt he deserved. But as he headed back toward the dining room, a question came into his mind. Where had they gotten enough people to have each person kill one? There just weren't that many liars in the community. Don't question it, he reminded himself. Trust in the reader and the decisions that are made. No one would kill an innocent person.